Sonic 3D Blast was the final Sonic game released for the Sega Genesis. Busy with Saturn development, yet wanting a 16-bit Sonic title for the holiday season in 1996, Sega farmed out the development to Traveler's Tales, who had developed the excellent Mickey Mania games, as well as the equally fantastic Toy Story. For the past decade, Traveler's Tales has been churning out countless successful LEGO games with no end in sight. But back to 1996, we have the subject of today's face-off, Sonic 3D Blast. First up is the Sega Genesis version. Sonic 3D Blast is an isometric adventure game with some platforming, featuring Sonic the Hedgehog and the familiar Sonic art style from the time. Sonic 3D Blast was met with mixed reviews upon release, and most critics were not pleased with the fetch quest gameplay. You see, rather than racing through environments at breakneck speed seeing how quickly you can reach the end post, Sonic 3D Blast is slow and requires you to complete an objective in order to progress. It is not very Sonic-like at all, and those looking for something more traditional were understandably let down. Basically, each zone is broken into 3 acts, with the third act being a boss fight with Eggman. During the acts, you have to find and destroy 5 badniks. Like always, these release a flicky, but now you have to collect them. Once you find all 5, you bring them to a ring, and the next section of the act is unlocked. In the first zone, each act has 2 sections, but after that, it's usually 3. This means to beat an act of Sonic 3D Blast, you have to locate 15 different enemies and bring them to 3 different checkpoints before you clear it. Honestly, I rather enjoy the concept. Much like those LEGO games, collecting things and bringing them to a checkpoint, then collecting more things is kind of fun. And the glue holding it all together is the level design. Despite being isometric, the levels are a good blend of linear and open, while mixing in plenty of secret nooks and crannies to explore. If you're paying even moderate attention to your surroundings, it's easy to make progress without getting lost. Traveler's Tales did a great job with the isometric engine, and Sonic 3D Blast has a very 3-dimensional feel to it, with plenty of elevation changes rather than a vast plane of flatness. The controls aren't bad either, and it is easy to navigate, avoid obstacles, bounce on robots, and collect flickies. Don't get me wrong, this isn't for everyone, and there is a reason you don't see many isometric platformers, but it ain't bad. If there's one thing everyone can agree on though, Sonic 3D Blast is full of ambition. There's actually an FMV intro, which is quite impressive for a cartridge release. The bonus stages also deserve a shout out, featuring some awesome line scrolling effects, giving a great sense of depth usually reserved for SNES Mode 7 effects. And then of course there is the music. Composed by Sega veterans, the soundtrack does not disappoint and falls right in line with the traditional excellence found in the series. Even cooler, Dreamcast fans will notice a few music pieces would later reappear in Sonic Adventure. Overall, Sonic 3D Blast for the Sega Genesis is a decent game. Of course, this brings us to the Sega Saturn version. With the highly anticipated Sonic Extreme grinding to a halt in the fall of 1996, Sega tasked the folks at Traveler's Tales to port the Genesis game to the Saturn, assuring the Saturn would also have a Sonic game for the flagship system in time for the holiday season. Being a rushed port, the game is fundamentally the same. For better or worse, everything I enjoy about Sonic 3D Blast is here. The level layouts are fun and again show off how well the developers were able to create functional 3-dimensional levels using the isometric viewpoints. However, without the limitations of the Sega Genesis, we can just see how beautiful the art assets are. All of the dithering is completely gone, and the subtle shading of the pre-rendered environments is exceptionally smooth. Backgrounds also feature more detail, including plenty of animated bits, helping the environments feel less stale. The most obvious difference is the ground. On the Genesis version, the tiles are solid colors, but for the Saturn, these two are enhanced and make the Saturn version feel like a distinct upgrade. There are also weather effects like fog, rain, and snow. It isn't much, but it is nice to see Traveler's Tales didn't waste the limited time available to port the game, but really put forth the effort to make the Saturn game feel more next-gen. The next upgrade is the bonus stages. During the 90s, Sega had a knack for making the Sonic bonus stages feel special, with cool graphical effects showing off their programming chops. For the Saturn version of Sonic 3D Blast, Sonic Team themselves pitched in and created some cool polygonal half-pipes, paying homage to Sonic 2 with some minor platforming thrown in for good measure. If you look closely, you'll again see some nods to Sonic Adventure, and it's just cool to see Sonic rendered with polygons on the Saturn. Next, an all-new music soundtrack by Richard Jacques was composed for the Saturn release. Richard Jacques also did the soundtrack for Sonic R, which I absolutely love, and his work here does not disappoint. The music genres are diverse, from pop, new age, elevator, club, and everything in between. It's still not as memorable as Sonic R, but most should appreciate the high-quality, vocal-free tunes. Finally, the Saturn version has a couple of gameplay tweaks, making the gameplay a touch more accessible. It fully supports the Saturn 3D pad, allowing for smooth movement in all directions, and the pause screen has a map of the level in case you get lost or something. These are minor improvements for sure, but I find their inclusions noteworthy. Not fixed, however, is the hit detection found on the bosses. Some of the Eggman encounters are rather basic, and the spotty collision isn't a big deal. In fact, a couple of the boss encounters are actually quite fun and do a wonderful job making use of the unique isometric viewpoints. However, the final boss is just a giant pain in the ass, and no matter how many times I play through Sonic 3D Blast, I find this final encounter frustrating. The boss encounter in Volcano Valley is also awful. It's hard not to fall into the lava as you have to jump on these small pipes to get a shot in at the doctor. I always dread this section, and it really should have been modified in both versions before release. Also left behind are some bad platforming sections. Sonic 3D Blast occasionally asks you to perform precision jumping. Sometimes it works, other times it doesn't. The fetch quest gameplay, overall lack of excitement, and occasionally frustrating bosses are enough to turn off many gamers, and I can't really blame them. Sonic 3D Blast is not a good Sonic game. Though if you like collecting things to unlock new areas, Sonic 3D Blast can be enjoyable. Just don't expect miracles, because a hidden gem, this is not. So, which version is better? Well, the Saturn definitely has the edge in terms of graphics. The smooth, pre-rendered environments are gorgeous and a terrific example of how this art style should be done. While the Genesis version is still a good-looking game, it can't match the visual prowess of the Saturn. The bonus stages are a bit trickier to judge. The Saturn stages are technically impressive, but the controls are floaty and gathering the required rings can be extremely difficult. On the Genesis, however, it's a fairly straightforward affair. Moving left and right, jumping over bombs is smooth and responsive, and gathering the required rings to unlock a Chaos Emerald is far more enjoyable. I give the edge to the Genesis. And finally, the soundtrack is also a tough call in perhaps the most subjective category. The Genesis has some outstanding chiptunes, and the tracks are even slightly altered on each act of the same zone, assuring they never wear out their welcome. I also love how a few of these were later remixed in Sonic Adventure. However, I still prefer the Saturn soundtrack. The compositions are catchy, there is a ton of depth and layers to the tracks, and more important, much more variety. Overall, the music does a better job fitting the different level themes and make for a more immersive experience. And of course, the Saturn version has better controls with the 3D pad. There really is no doubt Sonic 3D Blast on the Saturn is superior to its Genesis counterpart. But this doesn't render the Genesis version obsolete. A loose copy of Sonic 3D Blast on the Sega Genesis goes for about $5. At this price, I have no problem recommending the game, as most should have at least $5 worth of enjoyment. Things are a bit different on the Saturn, however. As of this video, a loose copy on the Saturn goes for $10 if you can stomach the thought of a loose CD game, and around $30 for a complete copy. At $30, recommending Sonic 3D Blast is not something I'm prepared to do. That $30 would be better spent elsewhere. So there you have it. The Saturn version is the best, but this victory comes with an asterisk, as the Genesis version is no slouch and a better value.